Hello, and welcome back to Around the Counter with Molly and Friends. I'm Molly Jones, and this is a podcast for people who care about Utah politics. With me today is Rebekah Duckett. She attended BYU and the University of Wyoming, earning a Bachelor and Master of Arts degrees, respectively. Her work has largely concentrated on the portrayal of race and gender in Mormon art. She has worked as an archivist at Utah Valley University and the Church History Library. Welcome Around the Counter, Rebekah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I was so excited. I heard you talk at Pints Over Perspectives a couple weeks ago, and I was just like, I have to have this woman on the podcast.
Well, thank you. That's so kind. That's so kind of you to say.
Yeah. So let's start with your background in art. In art history, you don't just look at what a painting depicts, but more broadly into why a particular piece was funded, who is centered, and what it says about power dynamics. So, who's your favorite artist and why?
I think right now I really love J. Kirk Richards' work. I think that he's doing a lot of interesting things with not just subverting some racial dynamics in the Book of Mormon, but he's also doing some things like with the history of the Book of Mormon that are really interesting. So he has a Book of Mormon series that he's been painting for several years now. And the way that he does it is he has this like top hat with a stone at the bottom, kind of like it's like not quite transparent, but something that he looks through. So he puts his face in the hat, and then he paints these scenes from the Book of Mormon. So quite subversive compared to this like really didactic illustrative style that you normally see Mormon artists trade in, but they're very abstract, and I love them. I love what he's doing with those pieces.
Is it Does it create something that is more movement based for you, or does it focus your eye more intently, or do you feel like you are Joseph Smith looking in the hat at the seeing stone?
I think he's doing so. I think typically, especially with the art, with the Book of Mormon art, I think that members of the church are particularly used to seeing or more comfortable with. They're really illustrative. They're really didactic. They're trying to teach a lesson. And I don't think his works are necessarily trying to teach any sort of lesson that's obvious. And I also think, yeah, it's just sometimes the paint is really thick. There's a lot of impasto.
What's
They kind
impasto?
of, they're like really thick. It's really thick layers of paint, that create a lot of, yeah, movement in the piece. And, um, I like, I think hopefully, if he ever hears this, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but he also does like work with like a palette knife too, to create a lot of texture on the pieces. So it's not just like photorealistic painting. That's not quite what other Mormon artists do, but I think the work that they create is defending this idea that the Book of Mormon is like a historical text. And I think he's more playing with the idea of like an interpretation of the Book of Mormon especially in the way that he's painting, where he's like mimicking Joseph Smith's interpretation of the gold plates. He's interpreting the Book of Mormon through his own device.
That's a
So,
really interesting perspective,
mhm.
especially because it brings a modern take to something that I suspect has been painted many times.
Yeah. And I feel like it's this like the wrestling with the history is what's creating the art in a really interesting way. And I think it allows for this, like, I don't know. It allows for more wrestling with the Book of Mormon and the text itself than I think other illustrations of the Book of Mormon do, which present it as historical.
So, what have you learned about the historical context of the LDS Church through paintings?
I think there's there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll just try to give like a very quick overview. Is that in the beginning there weren't a lot of LDS painters, especially not any that were like sponsored by the church. There's a couple of early ones. There's one from the very early days of the church. His name is CCA Christensen. BYU owns a couple of his works, and recently there's a scholar who just published a book about him. And he created these like huge panoramic like visuals of the history of the church, and they would be put onto these poles, and it was kind of like it was a moving picture, and it was used as sort of like a missionary tool. And then um they're just like images of Christ, or like that stuff was mostly borrowed from other religious traditions, so it's very Eurocentric ideals of what Christ looks like, and that is what people were comfortable with, and it's what has been used for a very long time. Um, and you don't really get like institutionally sponsored artists until later in the 19th century, when they're sponsoring men and I think one or two women to go to France and become art missionaries and learn how to paint. But
Art
um,
missionaries? Okay, sign me
yes.
up. I'm ready.
Yeah. Right. Send me to Paris to learn how to paint. And probably the one that people would be most familiar with is John Hafen, and he has some works in the Springville Art Museum, and then he also had painted some stuff in the Manti Temple, which I'm not sure the status of those pieces after the Manti Temple has been redone. But so then in the mid 20th century, you start getting more work that's actually being commissioned by local stakes or wards, and sometimes the church itself for different projects. So, and um, now we have artists that do get commissioned by the church, and we have LDS artists who are painting to sell their work. And so it's kind of all over the place. There's institutional support, and there's also LDS artists just creating um, and selling their work on their own.
That's really cool. So LDS art has a complex history regarding the depiction of race, especially concerning historical scriptural narratives and globalization. Can you talk a little bit about this history?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, really images of Christ they're borrowed from other religious traditions. So we even still use these today. They're like still in church buildings. People are still very familiar with Karl Bloch and Heinrich Hoffman. And that's still like really what the church is holding on to, is these really white Eurocentric versions of Christ. And I think that's even influenced how some artists work today, even if like there was a really popular series, which I wish I remember. I think it's called Reflections of Christ, and it's a photographer creating images of Christ. And it's the same. It's a white man um, modeling as Christ in these images. Um, so that's been Christ. And then you also have images of the Book of Mormon, which really I feel like they start to pop up more in the 20th century, but you have artists who are creating these work with this racial binary of Lamanite, dark skin, bad, Nephite, light skin, good. And in my work, I have studied and compared Minerva Teichert and Arnold Friberg a lot. And they're two very interesting case studies because they're painting around the same time, and they're also painting the same subjects. And their institutional support and the way that they've painted the exact same scenes is very different. And also their home lives were very different. And just they're two very fascinating case studies, where Minerva Teichert did not get a lot of institutional support. She offered her Book of Mormon series as like a gift to the church, and they didn't necessarily want it at the time. And then Arnold Friberg was commissioned by Amelia Cannon to paint images of the Book of Mormon for the Children's Friend, and they've been co-opted for use all over with the church. So those images themselves, they really, they're really showing this racial binary that I think a lot of us are familiar with and was even still and painfully used, I think, in the recent Book of Mormon videos where you have Nephi who's white and then his brothers who are dark skinned and like the bad guys.
Interesting. And so, for our listeners who are not maybe as familiar with the Book of Mormon, can you give us just a real quick explanation of Nephites and Lamanites? You've kind of touched on it, but let's just make sure we're
Hmm.
all clear here.
Yeah. So the Book of Mormon starts off as a story about a family living in Jerusalem, and the dad is basically like, we got to get out of here. The people are bad. And so they leave, and after some infighting amongst the brothers, there's uh, the three main that I'll talk about are Nephi and then Laman and Lemuel. So Laman and Lemuel are like the bad guys, and Nephi is the good guy. To me, he's always been an unreliable narrator, but that's neither here
Hot
nor
take,
there.
folks. Hot
Hot
take.
take. Um, but Nephi is always depicted, especially in LDS art, as the good guy. And so they travel on boats to the Americas, and they don't call it that at the time, but that's what Mormons understand it to be. So they travel to the Americas, and basically there's just more and more infighting, and so eventually these groups they split off. So there's Laman and Lemuel, their descendants become the Lamanites, and then Nephites are the descendants of Nephi. And so the story of the book, it's kind of this like epic story between these two groups, kind of fighting and going back and forth and trying to convert each other to Christianity, and then it culminates in Christ visiting the Americas after his resurrection. So
Wow.
that's an
So,
overview of the Book of Mormon.
an epic tale to give us in
An
30
epic tale.
seconds.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So
Mhm.
it does seem like they're grappling in from the sort of inception of the LDS Church. They're grappling with the idea of race. And have you seen in art the depiction of race shift over time, or is it always did it start one way and it's sort of that's the canon?
I think it's been that way for a long time, and you really start to see more mainstream LDS artists grapple with depictions of race around 2020 with
Oh,
with Black Lives Matter. And there's lots of LDS artists, um, like Anthony Sweat. He's a professor at BYU, and he's really trying to um de-center whiteness and also men in his work. But his depictions, so he paints a lot of church history scenes, and he also has has tried to paint Christ historically accurate. And then there's the owners of the Compass Gallery in Provo, and you can find them on Instagram, and they also talk about this a lot. And then there's people at the Church History Museum who are really looking to find diverse pieces of art and just depictions of diversity in the art itself. So there's the international, let's see, what's it called? The International Church Art Show, I think, and it happens every 3 years, and it's at the Church History Museum in Salt Lake. And I think I took my husband, who is not a member, and he was actually quite surprised at how nuanced and progressive and diverse some of the pieces were. So you do have a lot of people, even institutionally, really like seeking out and trying to display some of these pieces. But I think anything within a large bureaucracy, it's difficult for that to disseminate very widely. And so I think that's part of the problem right now is you have some institutional support for more diversity of work, but getting it to spread out is where the difficulty is right now.
do you think thinking about who is paid to create art and thinking about what I know about how many missionaries go to how many different nations and how diverse the body population is do you think the art these days is keeping up with the global demographic changes of the church? Or is there something else happening here? Like you mentioned Black Lives Matter.
I I do think that there's people in the LDS art world who are very conscious of that we're a global church. And I think that there's people working on it. But like I said, it's really hard to like get that stuff disseminating
Yeah.
outward. I
Is most
do.
of the art made in the United States in the Salt Lake area, like in the Utah area, or is it made all over the world and then it's funneled up into a central art bureaucracy?
So I think that so part of what the International Art Show does
Mm.
is they acquire pieces. So when you can acquire those pieces, then the church, like it also gets a little complicated with copyright. So and
I bet it does.
so it's not just sometimes like you can acquire a piece of art, but then what's the usage agreement? And I think that's part of where that comes in. So the church may own it, but they can only use it for certain purposes. And I think that those types of agreements have only gotten more complex in the digital age.
Yeah.
Um, so with art that's in public domain, that's very easy for the church to use and also to manipulate to their own doctrinal standards. So I've talked with people before and we like it drives us crazy how the church will like adapt certain images but then photoshop out halos or wings or whatever to fit like a really didactic understanding um of what the story is and like what fits with an LDS understanding of angels or Mary, the mother of Christ. So, so there's that.
That's blowing my mind for the
I
record.
know. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
That's pretty crazy because it's not illegal, but it's not really ethical, in my opinion. Um, so I think that's why it's great when you have artists that are creating today and they can say this is my work and this is the usage and no you can't adapt it. So I think so there's that. And there is um they do with the temples they do try to commission local artists to help paint the interiors. But I do think that a lot of the prints are predominantly done by American artists. I do um hope that st- I
Yeah.
think it's already starting to change, but yeah, the last time I went through a temple, it was still very white images of Christ everywhere. So,
Wow. So you're an art historian. When
mhm.
you look at a piece of art, what is a visual trope, specifically about gender, in traditional Mormon art that the average viewer is going to miss completely, but you as an art historian, you see it?
I think that racial binary that we've talked about before, but I also like when you put everything into context. So I talked a little bit about this in my thesis, but in Minerva Teichert's Book of Mormon pieces, I kind of laid them all out chronologically in the Book of Mormon narrative. Um which is not how she painted them. They were kind of painted in different orders, in a different order than what happens in the Book of Mormon narrative. So I was writing my thesis and I like put them all out and I realized that she was kind of creating this like crescendo of uh like racial purity, I guess you would say. So in the beginning, uh she's painting the characters of Lehi's family, Nephi and Laman and Lemuel and everyone else, in this kind of imagined in these Oriental tropes. And then it kind of moves into where the Nephites are still white and kind of Oriental. So she's still, in her mind, they're still like Jewish presenting, ancient Jewish presenting. And then the Lamanites are like Aztec or uh Yeah, just like in her mind, what she thought they would be. And then it kind of all culminates in this painting of when Christ visits the people in the Americas. And there's all different skin colors, but Christ is kind of at the pinnacle of the composition of this piece, and he is blindingly white, emanating whiteness. And then kind of with the downfall of the civilizations at the end of the Book of Mormon, she's painting them as Plains Indian, as like the Plains Indian trope as we would understand it. So she's being informed by LDS understanding of like the Nephites as a lost tribe of Israel. And then like she's very much delving into National Geographic, and she even visited South America. And then she's from Wyoming, so she knew about Native people. I think she was around near the Shoshone-Bannock tribe. Um, they're not plains. They're not the Plains Indian trope, obviously. So she's also being informed by like the 1950s, like cowboys and
Interesting.
or like Western film.
What
So
when was she painting these, in the 60s?
she was painting these. So it goes on. She was painting for a long time, and I
Oh,
think the
okay.
majority of her Book of Mormon pieces were in the 50s and 60s. She was born in the 1880s. She trained in Chicago
So she was
in
actually doing this at the end of her life.
she died in the 1970s, so she was doing this
Wow.
for a very long time. She was a very accomplished painter.
Wow.
Um and she was really prolific, and I think that's why people are very protective of her, and so it's hard for people to unpack that there's racial bias in her work. But
Have you
um
talked to your Mormon friends, your LDS friends who love her art about this topic? Like, how do those conversations go?
yeah, I it can be really complicated. There's a professional conference with Mormon historians every year. It's called the Mormon History Association Conference. And I was at a panel where people were getting very, very heated, and people who loved her, but who wanted to talk about the racial bias in her work. And I think it's difficult, but I think for me, it's more important that, for me, that when people go to an LDS church building, that they are feeling included and not excluded. So I think this is my most hot take that I will put it online. I used to tweet about this when Twitter still existed, but that I didn't think it was appropriate that her work was in the Manti Temple, which I know a lot of people are shocked by, but if you interpret it, it's not. So her work is in a place called the World Room, and there's people from all different walks of life, and they're like on the walls. And then it culminates to, at the very front, there's like the trope of an Indian brave kind of standing over the altar, welcoming people to the promised land. And Manti is a site of the Black Hawk War. So I I just feel like it is a completely inappropriate place, where Native people were being killed, to then have an image in one of the most sacred spaces in Mormon belief, to then have a completely mythical person inviting them to land that is already cultivated, but like looks just prime for the taking. To me, that felt inappropriate, but a lot of people are very defensive of her. And I don't think that they really are connecting, because they're so concerned, because she's really been neglected in lots of church history. But I just think when the context is the most sacred place to Mormons, um, that like it should, in my mind, it should have been removed and then put in a place where it could be given the proper context, because there's not text panels in a temple to tell you about the art. So,
That's really interesting. And I think that goes back to your work as an archivist, right? Like,
mhm,
so to an average person sitting at, our kitchen counter here,
mhm,
I kind of think to myself, oh, that's pretty art, but you have a much more nuanced perspective of it. And that's really interesting. And I also think in some respects, when we first started talking, I was like, oh, an archive, it just kind of sounds like a
mhm.
basement full of dusty old boxes. And an archivist sounds like a dusty old woman rattling about in the dark. But actually, this it's much more nuanced than that. You're doing so much more work. You're thinking more critically about some of these historical, cultural issues. So shed some light for us. What is it that an archivist actually does on your day-to-day work?
Day-to-day work is a lot of working with Excel spreadsheets, but
Just like
which is
everyone
like,
else.
yeah, which is everyone's job. But I think it's hard because I think it's actually really it's an exciting career, because like you said, you're like kind of you're the collector and disseminator of history. So the role of an archivist is to preserve and then make accessible history. But also part of that is kind of you get donations, people will approach you with what they think is important. But then it's also your job to try to understand what might be important in the future and what maybe scholars will want to come back and understand about that moment in time. So while I was working at UVU, it's something that my boss and I would talk about all the time about because this was COVID, this was like Black Lives Matter protests. What could we do to help people understand this moment in time? And I think it's difficult because you always like librarians. I think are librarians and archivists are kind of like an invisible career. Like you want to make yourself seem invisible to the scholar or the patron who's ever trying to look at the records. You're not trying to show any sort of bias, but people exist with bias, and I think that like sometimes this is I did a class and we had some archivists from the Library of Congress come to talk about this with us, where if you're searching for something in the archives digitally, there's usually metadata attached to that where, like search terms, where you're trying to classify what things are.
Mm.
And in the past, some of those terms are now understood to be racist. But if a scholar is looking to understand the racism of how archivists were classifying things, it's a complicated history. Like, what do you keep and how you classify that, I think changes over time. You have to be really conscious and constantly talking about these sorts of things. Um, and yeah, and I think sometimes there's parts of it where things were collected and then housed that weren't necessarily that community's responsibility to house and collect. And so how do you repatriate that back? And I think the LDS Church did that fairly recently. I don't know the details of that, but I think it's something that people are trying to reconcile with and work with the communities rather than taking everything as like
And
material.
is most of this stuff donated or is some of it, like you can imagine at a place like the MoMA, there are people who are like, I'm paying you to display my artifacts, with my name. That's a paid opportunity for the church, I'm sorry, for the museum to
Yeah,
receive
right.
some money. Is that similar or is this within the LDS Church archives? Is it solely donation based attached to a name where it came from? And like, that's just kind of that.
Well, I think the LDS Church archives are really unique in that the majority of the material there is it's church records. It's already owned by the church. So
Wow.
um
Because the
s-
church, what I know about the LDS church is everyone is very good at knowing who they are,
everyone
where
is
they came from.
right. Yeah, so there's tons and like primary attendance records and Relief Society minute notes. And so there's tons and tons of stuff like that. Um, and there's also a lot of things have been donated. I do think that there's archivists now or historians, it just kind of depends on the team that you're on, who specifically are going out and looking for there's like a better understanding of what might be a historical
Mm,
moment or what might be important. So there's more seeking those things out. Like if you're a mission president who opens an area,
interesting.
we want your journals,
Yeah.
or
Were
the
you
presidents of a mission. So yeah, so things like that
were
are
you
definitely
given
more sought after. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Were you given like a specific viewpoint or a set of goals in your archiving work? Or like was it just, you guys are doing certain things as part of initiatives and, it's just like any other job?
I think for me, so the team that I was on was particularly looking at how to give access to our digital records. So we were evaluating a lot of things like privacy of living people and
Mm.
copyright and maybe things that might be deemed confidential. Um, so that's mostly what I was dealing with. But we also would have, before, when we would evaluate stuff to be put online, we would see if things were sensitive, like if a missionary's journal from 1930s in Germany, what kind of things were they saying? Or honestly, missionaries in the South in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 90s, what kind of things were they saying? And kind of evaluating that and whether or not there needed to be any metadata that added that there was sensitive materials, or if, because the goal was never to close any of those things, to hide it, but just to make people aware, because I think sometimes it would shock people to know, like, oh, they're like this, my great great grandfather, this person that I thought was this really spiritual giant, and their journals in the church history library actually said some pretty harmful things. Um, and that
Do you
can
think
be,
many family members have had a bit of a reckoning going through some of that?
Um, maybe I do. When I was first hired, I do remember the director of the division sitting me down, and this was already after I had gone through my master's degree, so I was okay. I was kind of like, yes, this is obvious that you're saying this, but he just said, like, you're gonna encounter things that you're uncomfortable with, and like, if you have questions, find someone to talk about it with. Um, and I do think that there's, like, a lot more transparency with that kind of thing, and I also, like, I think it's important to look at your ancestors and kind of understand that there's good and bad, and that's okay, and how do you move forward from that, that, like, your family story can be redemptive from some of those darker pieces.
Oh, we love a redemption arc.
Yeah.
Oh, it's what all the best stories are made of, you know?
Mhm.
Even personally, I feel like I'm not a
Yeah.
perfect human. And so to be able to be offered that moment, I think is great. So
Yeah.
you've touched on this a little bit, but I'm really curious. What is the weirdest, most fascinating, or like most controversial piece of art that like influenced how you think about LDS art or LDS history that you can talk about publicly? Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I can talk about all the art publicly. I think it would have to be what I mentioned before, which is the world room in the Manti Temple. I had been really thinking about what I wanted to write my thesis on in graduate school, and I knew I wanted it to be Minerva Teichert, and I knew that she had painted in the world room at the Manti Temple, and so I was down here doing research for a summer and just in the archives at BYU. And I was like, well, I'll just take a break and go to the temple for a day. And I walked into that room and I was like, this is it. This is what my thesis has to be about, which was mostly understanding, um, using Minerva Teichert as a case study, but understanding how white members of the church view Native people and using art to understand that. So that I think completely changed my worldview on that. And there's a book that I read in graduate school that I think has been really helpful. It's called Playing Indian, and it's by Philip Deloria. Um, and there's a podcast that I've been listening to recently, by Native journalist, and it's called First America. And the most recent episode that she did, it's the second episode of the series. She interviews him and kind of talks about essentially white people cosplaying as Native to create their own identity. And they talk about the Boston Tea Party, and they talk about Boy Scouts, and they talk about camps. And I think that understanding has, I don't know, really, it helps me, like, that was where I first felt called to start talking about this, because that's when I understood how damaging it is to Native people.
Wow, that's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
So you talked a lot about the Manti Temple and how they created art, and that
Mhm.
art has really been a bit of controversy. Well,
Mhm.
the temple downtown has been under construction and they're getting ready to open soon. So, what kind of art do you think, like, do you expect to see there? And what is the story that you think the designers are trying to tell?
I am so curious because
Okay, me too.
I'm not really sure. I think there's a lot of tension between remodeling and what they've wanted to keep from the temple. And there's also been a lot of like flattening of Mormon identity, Mormon ethnicity. I think we're in a big, I like the church will go through these periods of like re-entrenchment where they really like try to emphasize their otherness, and then like assimilation into American culture. And I think we're in this period of assimilation right now. You see with a lot of temples, like they don't have the angel Moroni anymore. Um, we've
And that was the golden
the
statue on the
golden
top of
statue on
most of
top of
them.
the temples. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and you Like, I'm trying to think of some other things. Yeah, the word Mormon, like, the previous church president, Russell M. Nelson, has asked people to stop using, and so there's this, like, big de-emphasis, in Mormon identity, but I don't know how much that matters when, like, broad swaths of American Christianity don't believe that Mormons are Christian. So it's interesting to watch this kind of play out on a national stage.
I mean, the
Um,
Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth,
right.
recently he declassified Mormons as
Hmm.
Christians, and then Mike Lee lost his mind and
Right.
they were reclassified. And
Hmm.
I felt like I was looking online in a lot of these spaces and Twitter X and also in Blue Sky and then on like Instagram. A lot of people are having a discussion about are the people who follow the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Christians or are they not? And I think
Right.
that's been a really interesting discussion. And I think it actually leads into some of this cultural moment. And I think you're absolutely right about this cultural moment. Right now, I do think in a lot of way, like there's like a mainstream pop culture moment that's happening.
Hmm.
And I think most interestingly, it is not centered on LDS men. It is centered on LDS women. You see it, the secret lives of Mormon wives with mom talk. You see the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. Some of them are LDS, some of them are not. And then the very fascinating arc of Ballerina Farm. So, with your art historian hat on, how are you viewing this moment?
I think, and I touched on this a little bit, but I think people like to talk about like cultural Mormons, but I think I would even take it a little bit further than that. And this is like an academic framework. So I think you can argue either way, but this is like a framework that I have found really helpful to me, is to think of Mormonism as an ethnicity. So that's ritual, language patterns, food, appearance. It's kind of, the parallel would be, and I'm not equating them at all, but with Jewish people. Like, you can be Jewish ethnically, but not practicing. And so you can be informed by generational trauma. So all of that, I think, equates to this moment where people are really fascinated by Mormonism as an ethnicity, and they're able to, like, Hollywood has really wanted to commodify that recently, which I find really fascinating. And even the women themselves are not just using their image to like further the message of the church, they're using it to they're using markers of Mormonism like young motherhood, and they're commodifying it in ways that benefit them, which I on the one hand, I'm like, "You go, girl." On the other hand, I'm like, capitalism, like, maybe too much. Like, we don't need protein powder for everything, but yeah.
Do you want to
So,
talk about the protein powder? Because the Ballerina Farm protein powder, that to me,
mhm,
that's a fascinating case study.
yeah. So I'm I should just say, I don't have skin in the game about whether or not she's a good person or whatever. I think
And you're
she's
talking about,
fascinating.
can you give us a
Hannah
little
Nealman.
background about
Yeah.
Ballerina Farm, just to
Yeah.
level
So
set?
Ballerina Farm is a really popular Instagram and TikTok account. And it's this woman, Hannah Nealman. I think she just turned 36 and she has 9 children. And she lives on a farm out in Camas. And her husband is Daniel Nealman, and his father founded JetBlue. So they come from money. But the reason her account is called Ballerina Farm is because she went to Juilliard. She was a ballet dancer. And as she was graduating, she was pregnant with her first child. So since then
So they
they've
must have
moved.
gotten married quite early then.
Yeah, I don't know the exact timeline. I feel like
Okay.
I've been more of a recent follower of hers, but
Okay.
I totally understand why she has a following. She's like, it's her life is so idyllic and it's so like enchanting to watch everything as it's unfolding, and it's aspirational, it's fantastical, and it seems really appealing. But she's come under fire because she has been accused of promoting this really traditional lifestyle that may look very nice, but in actuality is really subjugating to women. Um, which, but there's been a lot of online discourse like, is that what's really happening? How much control does she have? It's called Ballerina Farm. It's built on her image, but he's the owner of the company. And so, how is all of that working? And I think that discourse really started when there was an article, I think it was the London Times a couple of years ago. Um, and then she's also been recently more in discussion in the zeitgeist because of the book Yesteryear that came out recently, which people speculate is based off her, but it's a work of fiction. So it's just more of like a literary discussion of trad wives in general.
What's a
Um,
trad wife?
A trad wife is an influencer that promotes like a traditional and more, I would say, just like pared back, idealistic lifestyle, like home cooked meals, lots of children, submitting to your husband. Um and I think that, yeah, so that I think that's basically, those are like the tenets of like being a trad wife online. Um
And then
so
also there is a religious component
There
generally.
is a yes,
And so with Ballerina Farm, they're LDS and
mhm,
they're centered in Utah, and that is a big component. And people really, I mean, one of the things I experience when I leave Utah and I say, "Oh, I'm from Utah," people either don't know where Utah is, or they go, "Oh my gosh, what do you know about Mormons?" And you
mhm,
get grilled about it. You're sort of a cultural attaché, regardless of how you want to be or not. And I
yeah.
think there's a lot of that sort of peeking in behind the curtain, like, what is this really like? That's so interesting. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna say, I think there's also a patriotic element to it. There's kind of like a,
Yeah,
we're like, let's go back to the frontier days, especially with Hannah Nealman's account. It feels very like pioneer cosplay, which, um, yeah, Mormons like to do, like with Trek. Like there's kind of this self hagiography of like, I'm going to turn myself into a Latter-day Saint, like the name of the church, by acting out this pioneer lifestyle. And she's able
that's
to monetize that and build an empire off of it, which That's
Ta
brilliant.
talk about the
Kudos to
empire.
her.
Yeah, what does she how does she make money off of this?
So they have so she started sharing her life, and she's almost certainly been able to monetize her content.
Mhm.
But then they also have like a farm to table storefront. I think it's in Midway. I haven't been. I want to go because I'm fascinated by it. And I think recently, so they did beef, which I don't think is exclusively sourced from her farm. And I think I think she sells baked goods and things like that. But she most recently launched her protein powder.
Ah.
So
Well, and
protein powder and electrolyte mix.
yes, you always need good electrolyte mix.
Hmm.
Um, so when you are looking at this and you're looking at how she's selling and you're looking at how she's making money for this, she's building her blocks on traditional lifestyle. Um, I think you said subservience to her husband. Was that
Hmm.
correct? But
Hmm.
then it's more than just that, I think, because she can't, I just can't imagine she can do all of this by herself.
Hmm.
So do you think that she's got helpers that help her, or is she really just doing all of this by herself out there in the prairie?
I think, and this is coming from someone who's from a very large family, and I've only heard in the discourse online, I've only heard one other person talk about this, and that is the hosts of the Diabolical Lies podcast. That in these large families, and like she could have a nanny, but you also start to rely on your other children for childcare and child rearing.
Mm.
And I have lots of friends, family who come from large families who don't have the access to money that the Nealmans have, who have done this, I don't know, not exactly this kind of lifestyle, but who have, um, hi, doggy. Um,
I can't do anything without her coming to say hi. Hi,
yeah.
babes. All right. Thank you.
Where you're really relying on the other children in the household to kind of make up where you can't.
That's
Um,
interesting.
But yeah, she did an interview recently, and she talked about, I think the interviewer asked her about like her village, what kind of village do you have? And I thought her answer was really interesting because she wasn't even talking about, I think she thought maybe they were questioning her about nannies or whatever, and
Hmm.
she talked about like not like letting go of control of the rearing of her children to someone else. Um, but I'm like, I'm sure she's had babysitters. I like her mom is she talks about her mom coming in now to help. I mean, she has to have
Yeah.
a lot of help in in the career that they're building in the farm there. And I we just have one kid, and I use babysitters all the time.
Yeah.
So I just don't see how you can't have children without, and a thriving career without people helping you on all sides, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I actually think that's a good segue into the next collection of really interesting Mormon women who are having a cultural moment. Like, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the secret lives of Mormon wives. Like,
Mhm.
they're just fascinating. I will be honest with you. I've watched a couple of episodes, and every time I watch it, I think to myself, these really aren't, they don't, to me, they just do not present as what I consider to be traditional
Mhm.
LDS women. Like, I see colloquially, the term porn shoulders. You can see they've got shoulders. There's
Mhm.
midriff that's bare. They're wearing crosses. And I think that's very interesting. And the way that they talk about their faith, I think it's Taylor Frankie Paul who's gone on to say, like you were saying, I'm more of a cultural Mormon than a believing Mormon or a practicing Mormon. Talk a little bit about them and their rise and their cultural moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of, I mean, these women, they made their name on TikTok, capitalizing on this kind of like uncanny valley lifestyle. So like, and this is why I like to talk about Mormonism as an ethnicity. Like Mormons are othered, and Mormon women have always been fascinating to Americans since the inception of Mormonism. And I think part of it is like the sexual taboo, which I didn't talk about very much at my presentation at Perspectives Over Pints, but that's definitely part of it. That there's this like the sexual taboo of polygamy is there's just always this ghost of polygamy that haunts Mormonism. And so, but I think now it's like, even if people understand that mainstream Mormons don't necessarily uh, practice polygamy anymore, there's always just this like, well, they're like young and they're married and they have babies. And that's a little bit of a sexual taboo to the rest of America. So I think
In
there's
the
this
case,
fascinating.
in the sense of like the rest of America is waiting until they're 25 or 30 to get married and have their first kid, whereas
Yeah.
LDS women are like getting married at 18 and having children.
Yeah. And
Okay.
they're locked down. They only have one sexual partner, but they're still like, but they're still hot and they're still like, and I think it's the rise of kind of like, it's been absolutely fascinating to me as someone who was an EFY counselor. And
What's
uh,
EFY?
um EFY was a church program. It stands for especially for youth, but it was a church camp for teenagers, and you would have young adults be the counselors. And one of the rules that I would enforce was about modesty and having everything like, you know, shirts covering cleavage, shoulders covered, bottoms down to your knees. And I was enforcing that. And I just look back and I feel awful if I ever traumatized anyone. But now I'm seeing online all these TikToks and it just looks like those rules aren't being enforced anymore. So I think there's this really interesting dynamic at play where some of these like Mormon ethnic markers are changing from the top down, like not using angel Moroni on temples, not using the word Mormon. But then there's some things like crosses, like it was pretty heavily emphasized when I was a young person growing up in the church that we don't do anything with crosses because it emphasizes the death of Jesus Christ, and that's not what Mormonism is about. But now, like you were saying on Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, most of the women are wearing crosses, which is it's like it's such an interesting cultural shift.
Yeah.
And and the same thing with modesty. I think because of social media being empowering to women and helping them not feel isolated, women are finally saying, like, garments are uncomfortable for us and I don't want to wear them anymore. And I think that's what you're really seeing on the show is women who feel a very strong connection to their Mormon ethnic identity, and keeping what they think is good and what they have decided is good, and then or like totally rejecting it altogether, but still having some Mormon ethnic markers. So,
Interesting. So Mormon women have long been used, and I am going to quote you here, to help, and I quote, prove that Mormon women are totally normal and not
mhm,
weird, end
mhm,
quote. Starting with the very first sister missionaries. And
mhm,
this to me feels like an evolution of the sister missionary journey in a lot
mhm,
of ways. Since I went to your talk and I've been paying attention on social media, I'm starting to see the church itself use sister missionaries more in Instagram ads and things like that. And I do think this kind of cultural missionary work is something that is like stronger than ever today. Um, so how does the church prepare women to be good ambassadors for the faith?
yeah, I think
And also,
it's
do they like this kind of, you know, media, right? Because it's
yeah.
twofold, I think.
Yeah, I think that Mormon women are taught to perform from a very early age. And this is with all kids. who are in like the children's organization in the LDS church in primary, like you start giving public talks when you're 3 years old. And then that just continues on until, like, you're in the youth program and you can be asked to give talks in a Sunday meeting in front of the whole congregation. And then, like I mentioned before, the church started to commemorate pioneer heritage. They started something called Trek, which is where kids would dress up as pioneers and they would go out and and it's totally a performance, right? Because some of the things that they would interact, like, just didn't happen. Like, if you went to Trek, and you were a woman, you likely participated in something called the women's pole, where the men get called away to fight with the Mormon battalion, and the women just have to pull these hand carts by themselves, and it's just totally anachronistic because, there was hand cart there was, like, a very small percentage of Mormon pioneers that pulled hand carts, and it wasn't during the time of the Mormon battalion. So it's all just, like, a lot of it yeah, if you talk to a lot of employees at the church history library, they also feel the same way where it's like, maybe this is a practice we need to move on from, as valuable as some people may have found it. But yeah, so that's a performance, and then you go, and the temple rites are all in front of other people. The Sunday rites, sacrament meeting is in front of another person. So it's very different than other liturgy and other religions where you may be doing, like, the priest is performing for the congregants, but this is everyone's kind of engaged in this performance together. So that's why I think that Mormon women are, like, uniquely positioned to be really good at influencing because we are always performing in Mormonism. You're always, like,
Yeah.
playing a role.
You talked again, man. Go to a talk that Rebekah gives, y'all. Very good. Lots to think about. But one of the things that stuck with me that I've been thinking a lot about is the fact that even your journaling as a young woman is intended to be
Mhm.
something that is read in the future by your
Mhm.
descendants. And so there's never a moment, the only space that's alone is in your own head.
Yeah, I even, like, I mean, it was pretty obvious, but hopefully he doesn't ever listen to this. I had the biggest crush on my MTC teacher
Oh,
when I
missionary training
was
center.
missionary training center, when I was preparing to be a missionary. And I, like, went out to the mission field. I would just be like, I was so brokenhearted because I found out he got engaged,
I'm
and
so
he told
sorry.
me he was not that he was gonna, like, write me with a capital W. Like, he was gonna send me a letter, and I was, like, so looking forward to it. Found out he got engaged. Devastated. And I was just having a hard time dealing with these feelings, but I didn't wanna write them down in my journal because my missionary journal was supposed to be for my kids, like, any future kids that I may have or future descendants, and I was so ashamed of, like, having all of these feelings. And so my trainer told me we were in Korea, and so there's tons of stationery. She was like, just buy another journal and have that be something that you burn later, which I might still have it. I think I might have kept it because, so who knows what's in there. I think I wrote like 3 pages in it, but yeah, that kind of, like, excising of what you actually feel is something that's very familiar, I think, to anyone in the church, but,
And also building a personal brand that
mhm,
reflects who you think the church or Christ or your family should see, right?
mhm,
And that's actually something that I think makes these influencers uniquely good. So they've been
mhm,
building a brand, they've been building a presentation their whole life. They've been trained to do that.
yeah, and I think like, it's hard because when you would present this to them as a performance, they would say, like, "No, this is my real life," but it's and I'm not talking in performance as, like, it's fake necessarily, but it's like how we talk about gender performance, where if this is what feels like if you want what you feel like your interior is to be reflected on the outside, and that's the type of performance I mean. It's where you're, like, very carefully curating what you want your outside self to be to the world, and that's, like, the kind of performance I'm talking about. So it's not necessarily untruthful, but it is not the whole picture.
Yeah, I think that's right. Switching gears just a little bit here, you have also talked about the twins of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery, and how the right to vote was first given to Mormon women, but then was taken away because those Mormon women didn't stand up to their oppressors and throw off their shackles,
Mhm,
essentially.
mhm,
So, to my political policy wonk brain, like, this is wild. Can you
mhm.
unpack this a little bit for us and talk a little bit about that historical context?
Yeah, so that term, the twin relics
Twins
of
of barbarism.
barbarism. Yeah, the twin relics of barbarism. That's a historical term that, like, the Republican Party was using during the Civil War
What?
to describe these two things that they felt were like the evils going on in the United States. So at the end of the Civil War, like after slavery had been abolished, they're like, okay, this is it. We're going gung ho on polygamy. And um, so there's this, like, growing Republican contingent in Washington, D.C. that wants this to be done. And then there's, like, competing powers in Utah Territory, because this was before Utah had become a state, where they're kind of thinking like they have this fascination with Mormon women. They're like, okay, if we give them the right to vote, then surely they will vote to end polygamy, and we want that done, and we want to be able to, like, end this growing uh political, like, power that's happening in Utah. So women get the right to vote when Utah was a territory, and that happens in, I hopefully I remember all my dates correctly, 1870. And then the first, it's like happens on February 13th. The first woman votes, Sarah Young, on February 14th, 1870. So first woman to vote in the United States. And then, nothing happens. The polygamy is still still the norm, still the status quo. I think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around. A book that I would recommend is House Full of Females by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, taught at Harvard. She's amazing. She's a Mormon woman herself. But basically, the thesis of the book is how polygamy was really both subjugating and empowering for women in the 19th century. And I think that can help people kind of understand where these women were coming from, where if you were a married woman in the 19th century, you had a lot more freedom and agency. So you have these women in certain situations where they are able to go back east and have careers, and they were granted voting power, and they are liking some aspects of their life. Like, obviously that's not true for everyone who was in a polygamous relationship. Some of these women were extremely isolated. There's complicated family dynamics, sisters marrying the same husband, you know. All of this is really complicated, but in some cases, women felt empowered by this. They were, like, involved in the national suffrage movement. Anyway, it's very complicated. But 1870s go on, 1880s, and Washington, D.C. is still wanting to end polygamy. So the Emmons-Tucker Act is passed. I think it's 1887, and that disenfranchises every woman in the state in a polygamous relationship or not.
And
Um,
that's more holistic, like the entire United States, all women lost the right to vote. Or was
the
it
so the
just in Utah?
It was the Edmunds-Tucker Act was, like, specifically in Utah, where they I'm probably a historian who is more knowledgeable on me than this, will, like, correct me if they watch this, but, um, it, uh it makes it so that anyone who is practicing polygamy can be prosecuted, and then they kind of tack this on as part of it, that women are disenfranchised with the Edmunds-Tucker Act.
And then women don't
So
gain the right to vote again until the 19th Amendment is passed.
with federal elections, so Utah women do regain the right to vote when Utah becomes a state, and it's debated when the Utah Constitution is being written, but everyone, since women had the right to vote, everyone is it's not that hotly contested.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
so it gets put back in as part of the Utah Constitution, and Utah women are able to vote in state elections.
Do you still hear echoes of this fight in politics today?
Yes, I think we were talking about this, and I'm really interested to see how this will play out with Mormon women, because there's uh Mormon women, I think in some regards feel very empowered within their own organizations within Mormonism. So I think historically Mormon women felt very empowered by Relief Society. They felt very empowered by being involved with suffrage organizations. But now you kind of have this interesting, I don't know, juxtaposition of Mormon women who have felt very empowered in their own identity, trying to be more mainstream Christian with crosses, not using Mormon, just very identifying as Christian, and then the Christian right trying to push this disenfranchisement agenda with the SAVE Act. So I'm curious what that will look like. I think members of the church are encouraged to be politically active, and that's been the case for a long time. Um
Proposition 4 would like a word.
yeah, yeah. Um yeah, I so we'll see what happens. I think I grew up in a very politically active, civically oriented family where
Hmm.
my grandmother immigrated from Switzerland in the 50s, and Swiss women were enfranchised until the 70s. So it's kind of like a family legacy where we vote every election, we volunteer to work at the polls, we try to be informed, and uh, I don't I don't know. A lot of Mormon families that I have encountered they are also very politically involved. Um, so we'll see where this takes us. Maybe this will be a split. I don't know. Mormon voters have split with the right in recent years, so knock on
Yeah.
wood.
Yeah, I'm hoping to have Professor J. Crew on here to talk about some of that
Mhm.
shift because Utah is shifting left the most in the
Mhm.
2024 election. But the
Mhm.
fun and interesting fact about that is that they're not becoming Democrats. They're just moving away from the hard right Christian
Mhm.
movement and the MAGA movement. And I think that's a fascinating subplot. Okay. Well, seems like a pretty good place to stop. So the
Mhm.
final question that we always like to ask is, how are you
Mhm.
finding joy in your life right now?
Um, I think two things. My husband and I were obsessed with Widow's Bay, the Apple TV show recently, which I think is a really interesting metaphor on grief. And it's a horror show, but it's also a comedy show. And anyway, it's fantastic. It's very good. And
So you're
then
telling me you're finding joy through horror? Horror
yes,
and
which I
grief?
think
Okay.
horror and grief, but it's also a comedy show. So it's been nice to find something to laugh at. But I think that's the point of the show is it's like an island that was settled, colonized in the 1600s, and they're having to deal with the outcome of what the founders did, and how do you go through the modern world with some of the mistakes that people have made in the past. And
Back to the redemption arc.
yeah, so it's very, very good. Ghosts of your forefathers and how they haunt you, and and how that can
Cool.
be funny sometimes. So that's good. And then my husband and I just went to Santa Fe, and I don't know. I just love that city. I love Santa Fe. So I'm just finding joy in travel and that TV show lately. So
That's awesome. Thank you, Rebekah Duckett. And
yeah.
thank you so much for listening today. You can catch Around the Counter with Molly and Friends on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Substack, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. We air on Sugar House Community Radio Sundays at 8 p.m. and Wednesdays at 7 a.m. See you next week.